The Thousand Suns have some really cool looking units, and one of these units, despite having rules, doesn't actually have an official model, the Sorcerer in Terminator armor. So when I wanted to add one to my army, I started looking online for Terminator Librarians for one I could buy and then convert into a Sorcerer. But then I remembered that one of the earliest models that I still had was one of the OG metal Librarians, so I thought he'd be a perfect candidate for a fresh coat of paint to head up my Thousand Suns army. Now here is my Librarian, and he's very much from a time where I didn't necessarily understand how to apply Null Oil, where it was very much a case of just slopping it on, leaving it, and then hoping for the best. But given this guy is probably what, 15-20 years old, you know, I'm not too disappointed with how I painted him. Now you can see that I've had to basically use little pieces of wood because I'm almost certain that I originally stuck this guy down with plastic glue, and he's made of metal, so it didn't work too well. So rather than buying super glue, my solution was to use PVA glue. And that's what I've done with his hand as well, which is why he's got an absolute massive glob of like glue, which I'm pretty sure I've re-glued multiple times. But I'm very glad I've held on to this miniature because it's very much a throwback to what I used to paint like and who I was as a youngin and all that good stuff, you know? But now that I am a little bit of a better painter, I'd very much like to use him for a Thousand Suns Sorcerer. And I was comparing him to like the sizes of other Thousand Suns Scarab Occult Terminators, and he's definitely like a little bit smaller and not as chunky, but he's really not that too far off. So I don't think I've got to add too much chunk to him, especially when he's got his big sword arm force thingamajiggy on. But I'll definitely add some cork to the base to make him a little bit taller. Also, I think I'll be cutting off the end of this Imperial Eagle because he is a naughty boy. And I printed off some of these guys. So what I reckon I'll do is probably trim the end of this off and chuck it on the end there. So it'll be a little bit longer, so it'll give him a little bit more mass, and then also make him a little bit more Thousand Sunsies with the Egyptian kind of theme. Also for his Storm Bolter, which is actually gold because I'm almost certain that in the game he was about to die and there was like a Hive Tyrant on one wound and he shot him and then wounded with one and then he died, and then to like mark him as a pro dude and to congratulate him for killing a Hive Tyrant, I think I painted his gun gold, which is kind of cute. But I reckon I'll get rid of that, chuck on a hand, just drop a hand on from the Rubric Marines, and I've got a whole bunch of these like cute little fire things, so I'll have to see what the vibe is, but I reckon I'll have at least one of these coming out from his hand, and then some of these others around his base. Also, I very much like to have like a little crest thing on top of his head to kind of be very much like the Terminators. But that would mean that it would be kind of blocking his book thing. So I'm going to have a play around to see what the go is. But I'd very much like to keep the model as original as possible with adding a couple bits and pieces to make him look a bit more Thousand Sunsy. So I'll see what I do. But to begin with, he definitely needs to have his paint stripped, so we're going to go and give him a bath in isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol. What is it and what is it used for? Great questions. I'm glad you asked. At least for my purposes, we're using it to strip the paint off Mr. Magic. I've used it on a bunch of plastic models in the past, but I'm yet to try it out on metal, so I'm hoping it goes all right. There are two things that are worth knowing as well. It's a great idea to wear gloves when using and actually removing the paint from a model, something I have learnt to my detriment potentially later in this video. And it's also certainly not for drinking, although not that that's something that I discovered to my detriment. Just worth knowing, don't drink it, even though it's got alcohol in the name. So to begin, we'll chuck our guy in a little dish and fill it up until the model is all covered. I let him soak for a good 10 to 15 minutes before coming back in with an old toothbrush and giving him a scrub. You can see that some of the paint has come off, but we'll leave him for a bit longer to see if that helps with removing any of that additional paint. Okay, so after an hour or so of having a bath and really going to town scrubbing, and then using some of these guys to really pick off some of the remaining bits, the model's looking pretty good. Now there's obviously some bits left over, but for the most part I'm pretty happy with how he is, and I think he's in a pretty good position to start adding bits and pieces. Now I will say that I really should have worn a glove because now my hand is very dark. So I hope that wears out sooner rather than later, but learn from my mistakes, wear a glove. But with that, I think we're pretty much good to go in and start cutting bits off and adding them to the base. Okay, so I've made some minor adjustments to Mr. Magic Man. I mean, you can probably tell exactly what they are, but as I mentioned, I've added a hand, I've added a little cute little fireball, I've added a khopesh to the end of his staff, getting rid of that Imperial Eagle, then also getting rid of the Imperial Eagle on the top of his book and replacing it with a staff, or the top of a staff from one of the Terminators. So fairly minor changes, and I'm hoping that he'll look not too dinky compared to his bigger brethren, but yeah, we'll see how we go. Now, before adding him to the base, I'll be adding a magnet to it. Now, I've always had issues with adding magnets to bases, so I actually went ahead and designed myself a cute little STL for helping applying magnets. So basically the whole idea is you've got a magnet in the base, and then you've got rings that correspond with the upside down dimensions of 25mm, 28mm, 32mm, 40mm, and 50mm. So the whole idea is you basically get your super glue, you chuck it in the middle approximately of the base-ish. You basically line it up on the base that it's on, and all you do, you chuck your magnet on. And normally I would use a 10mm by 2mm base, sorry, 10mm by 2mm magnet for a 40mm base, but because Mr. Mans is a little bit chunky because it's made of metal, I'm using a 12mm magnet. So if you'd actually like to purchase your own one of these, I've listed a whole bunch of them up in Etsy along with relevant bases, as well as the magnets that I would recommend using. I'm still making some minor adjustments to some of the sizings on the rings, so it'll hopefully be up by the time this video is up. Yeah, but if not, it'll be on Etsy very soon. But with that, let's get started on the base. Okay, so I've played a little bit around with the base, and whoa! Here is my master plan. So I've still got to put some Vallejo's Earth on here to mimic what sand will look like. But basically, Mans is going to stand... Oh my god, it's got stuck to it. Mans is going to stand like that. And with the fire on either side, it's going to be like vibing the whole... He had a wall of fire here, and then he like sucked up some of the fire or something, and there's a blasting it out of his hand. That's what I'm thinking. And I'm going to keep him separate until they're both painted, because if he's glued down there, it's going to be very hard to actually paint the fire and then the bounce on his legs. So just going to keep them separate until they're both done, and then I'll stick them together. But that's what I'm thinking. I can see the vision, but we'll see how it actually looks like when it all comes together. But I'm here for it. Now with the model all ready to go, the first thing I wanted to do was obviously prime it, and to do that I used some of Vallejo's Grey Primer. Now this comes pre-thinned, so it goes through beautifully through their airbrush, but feel free to use a rattle can or paint on if that's your preferred approach. After having done that, I then applied some of Vallejo's Sapphire Blue, which is part of their new True Metallics line. Again, I applied this through the airbrush, and because it's pre-thinned, it doesn't actually need thinning to shoot through the airbrush. After having applied that, I then mixed up the 50-50 mix of the sapphire blue base and the sapphire blue highlight to then use that as a bit of a zenithal. Now, as the highlight paint isn't actually pre-thinned, after mixing it with the sapphire blue base, I then added a bit of thinner to ensure that it flowed through the airbrush as expected. Now, after having applied that zenithal with the sapphire blue mix, I then went in and started on the cloak. To do this, I started with a base of Vallejo Steel Grey and then slowly worked in more and more of Vallejo's off-white into each subsequent layer until I was left with just off-white. After that, I then went in and did the books and scrolls. So again, very similar to the approach taken for the cloak, I layered it. So to begin, start with khaki and then mix in more and more of Vallejo's bone white until you're just left with bone. Now, unlike the cloak, which was built up on layers of smooth layers, it doesn't matter so much for the books or the scrolls because the dispersion that exists between the different layers and colors helps to build that idea of aged paper. With the books and scrolls all done, I then went in with a mixture of grays, whites, and reds to use that as actually writing on the books themselves. Now you can just go in and scribble in some pretend writing, which I definitely did in a few instances, but I feel adding in a couple of extra colors as well as some slight imagery helps to sell the effect of more than just a simple book and really helps take it to the next level. After having finished all of the writing on the books and the scrolls, I then went in with some of Vallejo's Glorious Gold to coat all of the gold on the model. As part of blocking in the initial colors on the model, I then went in with some of Vallejo's Succubus Skin on the face. I then followed this up with a coat of Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a wash, just to help build in the recesses some darker blue. Now normally I wouldn't use a blue wash on a face, but to sell that effect of potentially having given into chaos and having a little bit more of a decaying looking flesh feel, I thought the blue would be a good choice. Now for all the metals, we used some of Vallejo's dark gunmetal. For any of the purity seals and a couple of the tubes, we went in with a base coat of Vallejo's Hull Red, and then mixing this in with Vallejo's Flat Earth, slowly built up a couple of layers until we're just left with a flat red to provide the highest level of highlights. For the casings of the books themselves, we started with a base of charred brown and very similar to the red, slowly worked in more and more of Vallejo's earth to build up that transition from darker brown from the charred brown up to the lighter brown of the earth. With the majority of the colors blocked in, we're now going to go back in and hit the face to bring it up a couple of levels. So firstly, having applied the previous wash to the face, we're going to use that succubus flesh to go back in and bring it up to the base level, leaving that wash in the recesses to help build the shading. Having applied that succubus flesh, we're then going to start mixing in some of Vallejo's rosy flesh, again to start building up some of the highlights, focusing on the more exposed areas of the model, like the cheekbones, the nose, the forehead, and the chin. Finally, after having applied a couple of layers of this, getting more and more of the rosy flesh, we then provide a final highlight of just pale flesh, and again just hitting the very exposed areas of the face, so hitting the nose, the very exposed sections of the chin, and a little bit on the collarbones. Now with the base of the model all blocked in, it's now time to go and hit him with an oil wash. Now I've spoken before, a number of times actually, about how much I enjoy using oil washes on models, and this guy is going to be no different. So to begin, we obviously have to mix the oil wash. So to do that, we're going to be using a 3-to-1 mix of ABT's Burnt Umber and Ivory Black, using a healthy amount of AK Interactive's White Spirits. Now I mix this in a metal mixing cup using a fairly old synthetic brush. Now the oils will actually mess up your brush, so I'd highly recommend using an old brush you don't care about, i.e. not your Raphael Kalinsky brushes, because it will destroy them. Now after having mixed it up, you want to slop it on all over the model. Now it might look a little bit daunting and scary, but don't worry, it's all part of the plan. So after having applied the wash, we actually have to let it cure a little bit. Now unlike acrylics, which can dry almost instantly, oils can take hours to days to cure depending on how much you've used. We're going to use that to our advantage to let it tint the model as well as get into the recesses of the model and then remove any of the excess. Unlike acrylics, this basically means that we don't necessarily have to apply any layers on top of the model after having applied the wash. So what we're going to do, I've gone and left mine for 30 minutes, and then using a combination of makeup sponges and makeup applicators, we're then going to be hitting the exposed areas of the model to remove any of that excess oil wash. And now in some instances you can see that I have dipped my makeup applicator in some white spirits, and this is to draw off even more of that wash because I really want to leave those exposed areas of armor in particular exposed, because it's trying to mimic the idea of light hitting the model, and if there's a wash on it, it reduces that effect. So having done that, it's helped build all of the shadows in the recesses of the model, as well as tinting the gold as well as the rest of the colors in a really nice browny black type of tint, which I'm really happy with. Now, before we can actually go back in and hit the model with some other paints, we really have to let it dry, and to do that I let it dry overnight. So whilst the wash is drying, I then went in and hit the base. So to begin with, I hit all of the sand areas at the base with Vallejo's earth, as well as hitting the stone areas or the rocks with some dark blue grey. Now for the earth, I use Agrax Earthshade to shade it, and I use Nuln Oil for the rocks. After the washes have dried, I'll then go back in and dry brush some extra paint on. So on the sand, I use Vallejo's earth again, followed up by a dry brush of Plague Brown. Important to note that you're obviously trying to hit less of the sand with the Plague Brown to build up that idea of lighter patches of sand compared to the darker patches which is held by the earth. For the stones, very similar approach. The first dry brush is going in with some dark blue grey, and then finishing it up with some of Vallejo's Stonewall Grey. Now to make the base pop a little bit more, we'll add some little tufts from Gamer Grass. With that in mind, it's now time to go to bed and pick up this model again in the morning. It's now the next day, and I'm confident the oils have cured enough to enable me to start applying some additional paints. So to begin with, we're going to go in with some of Vallejo's white ink through the airbrush, making use of some flow improver to ensure that it doesn't dry in the tip, and applying this to all of the areas that we're wanting to either hit with the fluorescent green or to potentially act as a bit of spillover, especially as can be seen on the base. After having applied the white ink, we are now going to go in with some of Vallejo's fluorescent green, again making use of flow improver so it doesn't dry in the tip, and using this to spray any of the areas that we actually hit with the white ink. Again, some overspray here is not a bad thing, and in fact it's a good thing, because as you can see, especially on the model and around the base, overspray helps build that idea of bounce light, which you would expect from something which is very fluorescently and magically green. After having applied that fluorescent green, we are then going to go in with some green ink, again using some flow improver, and we're using this to help build that idea of heat dissipation, where the center of the fire is nice and hot and bright, and the further you get away from it, the darker it's going to get. So to build that difference, we're going to go in with the green ink and spray it on. To build this even further, we're going to use some of Vallejo's violet ink to hit the very exposed areas of the fire to really help sell the effect that the further away you're getting from the fire, the cooler and darker it is. Now with the fires all done, it's now time to go in and assemble him. Because he is a metal boy, we're going to be using some super glue to ensure that he stays on the base. After he's attached, it's now time to rim the base with some of Vallejo's charcoal, give him a coat of satin varnish, and he's all good to go. Now, although he's maybe not as zinchy as he could be, I'm really happy with how he's turned out. I've really loved this model, and it holds a special place in my heart as a piece of my childhood. With the skills I've learnt between now and then, I reckon he's looking pretty cool and a very worthwhile addition to my Thousand Suns army. But that's it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed and have a wonderful day.